Yo guys, Baku is the next track on the F123 calendar after Australia, and it presents a completely different challenge. Baku's a technical street circuit which mixes extremely slow corners, typical of a street circuit, with an extremely long straight. This combination presents some problems when creating a car setup and means that any setup that we create will essentially be a compromise between top speed and downforce. In F123, Baku feels pretty different to previous games. The track seems to have been adjusted and now a lot more precision is needed, and the braking zones are slightly longer. This means our car setup needs to be on point, and this was certainly not an easy car setup to create. But here's our F123 Baku car setup, which has been designed for long distance races. Now Baku's a really unique track when it comes to our aero setup. It shares a lot of similarities with Singapore, with all of the 90-degree left and right turns, and these typically require an extremely high downforce setup. However, that long pitch straight, which is one of the longest in F1, means that if you do run a high downforce setup, you'll lose a ton of time down this straight. For this reason alone, we need to prioritise a low downforce setup. Now the setup I've gone for is 13 for the front wing aero and 12 for the rear. Rear downforce is important at this track as you'll be constantly fighting for traction and grip. However, it's even more important to have a responsive car that's happy to turn into those 90-degree corners with ease, and this setup achieves this goal. As I just mentioned, rear traction is a problem around Baku. This track is extremely rear limited, meaning your rear tyres will wear a lot quicker than your fronts. One of the best ways to combat this and ensure you have good traction is by setting our on-throttle differential setup to 50. And that's exactly what I've done. Almost. I've actually opted for an on-throttle diff setup of 51 and an off-throttle diff setup of 50. Now I focused the suspension geometry setup on performance over tyre life. While it is important to ensure your tyres last as long as possible, any other suspension geometry apart from this one simply made the car not have the mechanical grip needed mid-corner. Go with -2.5 on the front camber and -1.2 on the rear, and then lower the front and rear toe all the way to their minimum values. Your front tyres can struggle to be brought up to temperature around Baku, so setting a pretty aggressive geometry setup can actually help with this a little bit. Now, the suspension setup did cause me some problems. A stiff suspension would be ideal to increase responsiveness. However, the sheer number of large curbs mean that running a stiff suspension setup can cause all sorts of issues during a race. If you hit any of the curbs with an overly stiff suspension, you'll be having an early dinner date with the wall. Now I've softened the suspension down to 20 at the front and 8 at the rear. This provides an easier car to drive, which will allow you to be consistent throughout a longer race. Then set the anti-roll bars to 8 at the front and just 1 at the rear. You can lower the ride height right down, which is kind of unusual for a street circuit, but luckily Baku is quite flat, so you can get away with 32 at the front and 33 at the rear. This suspension setup is really designed for stability and making sure that the car is as easy to drive as possible. Now for the brakes, go with our usual approach with 100% brake pressure and 56% brake bias. Rear locking can really be an issue at some of the corners around Baku, so you can move the brake bias a little further forward than our usual 55%. Then the tyre pressures are fairly high at the front for an F123 setup and very low at the rear, and the reason for this is due to all of the slow corners. Heating your front tyres can be a problem, but all of the high traction zones mean you can easily overheat your rears. Go for 23 psi for both front tyres, and then 20.2 psi on the rear right and 20.3 on the rear left. And that completes our F123 Baku car setup. Now this setup was extremely tricky to create because the track itself drives a little differently this year, and even with the improvements to traction in this year's game, it's still incredibly hard to find traction throughout a race, which really means the rear tyres can go off quickly. Now if you enjoy this setup, hit that like button, and if you've made any tweaks, let me know in the comments below. Also make sure you're subscribed to our channel to be notified when I drop new F123 setup videos, which at the moment is every single day. But for now guys, enjoy this tricky circuit and I'll see you on track.